I'm already loaded.
Okay.
This is me here.
Greetings again this morning. Things seem to be humming along nicely. Everybody looks happy, and I hope we get a lot more out of our keynote speakers. We're about to begin in a minute, so I thought I'd shut everyone up with a poem in order to clear the decks for our next speaker. This is called Rat-a-tat-tat. Rat-a-tat-tat, who's that knocking? Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. It's Machine Gun Johnny, chatter-chat-chat, chatter-chat-chat, sweeping the field, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, looking for the ball in a man-sized hat for a chatter-chat-chat, chatter-chat-chat, for empire, adventure and all that, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, the bullets spat from the nostrils of the gun, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, mothers weep, there lies your son, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, 16 years old, fancy that, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, freedom's not cheap, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, do you remember, chatter-chat-chat, rat-a-tat-tat, who's that knocking, rat-a-tat-tat, chatter-chat-chat. I wrote that poem after getting a book out from the library and reading the book about the number of young people under the age of 16 who signed up in England to go and fight in the First World War. There's over 10,000 of them. So there you are. Sad but helpful information that I got from the library enabled me to write this poem. And sometimes words seem but sad things. They play and sing and weep on my heartstrings. So I turn them into darts and give them wings. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Anahira Morihu, who's the chairperson for this keynote session.
Kia ora! Ka pai. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karangatanga maha o ngā hau e whā, tēnei te mihi kia koutou, kua hui mai nei, ka whakarongo ki te manu, i tangi, i karanga atu, i karanga mai, i tēnei wā, tui ā. He mihi ki a koe te rangatira e aroha. Nau te wahine toa o ngā kaupapa Māori, e pāna ki te mana hinengaro, te mana whenua, nō reira tēnei te mihi nunu ki a koe. Okay, as a translation, you're not going to get one. But what I can say, and what I will say, is this beautiful lady, Aroha Mead, needs no further introduction, as she is a very, very strong and powerful woman in the world of Māori. She takes its issues internationally and takes them with pride and with strength and the support of her family, very well-known family. But without further ado, she can introduce herself and you will hear from her this beautiful, beautiful manu that flies around the world and flies around the motu supporting kaupapa. Kaupapa Māori. Nō reira, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou katoa.
Well, kia ora koutou and tēnā koe Anahere for a beautiful introduction. I want to thank the conference organisers for inviting me, and particularly David Jones, who's your bicultural chair of the organising committee, but he's also my colleague at Victoria University. My paid job, I'm a senior lecturer in the Māori Business Unit of Victoria Management School in the Commerce faculty. You don't see many Māori situated in commerce faculties, especially Māori activists, but there I am, and deliberately so. But I do a lot of voluntary work, and I always have, and currently I'm chairing a global commission of the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And the commission I chair is called the Commission on Environment, Economic and Social Policy. It's a scientific commission comprised of over 1,200 experts from approximately 60 countries in the world. And its task is to be multidisciplinary and to make the linkages between environment, economic policy, cultural and social issues, something very much needed in the world today. Today I'm going to talk to you about a very important claim that has just reached a pinnacle here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's popularly known as the Y262 claim. And for those not familiar with the Treaty of Waitangi settlement process, Y is the chronological number by which a claim is accepted by the tribunal. So 262 indicates it's a fairly old claim because we're into the 2000s now. I want to share with you the findings of the Waitangi Tribunal, who have just issued their report, because their findings have great implications for anyone working with mātauranga Māori, Māori knowledge, or taonga Māori, Māori treasures of both the material and immaterial kind. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to the claim itself. I'll talk about some of the overarching findings, and then some of the specific chapters of the tribunal's report, and then I'll focus more precisely on one chapter called When the Crown Controls Mātauranga Māori, as I think it will have a lot of resonance with the work you do. So, just to go through the claim, it was lodged by 6 claimants. The tribunal process doesn't allow collectives to lodge a claim, so it has to be individuals on behalf of a wider group. So the 6 claimants, I have to say, none of them are still surviving. They've all passed on, but they came together because they were very concerned about the impact of privatisation and intellectual property rights on the well-being of the cultural heritage, not only of Māori, but of New Zealand. The basis of the claim is that they took the view that the Crown or government had failed to actively protect the exercise of tino rangatiratanga and kaitiakitanga. For those not familiar with these terms, I'll be using them throughout my presentation, and you'll get a evolving definition of what those mean. But they say that the Crown failed to protect the exercise of tino rangatiratanga sovereignty and kaitiakitanga guardianship by the claimants over Indigenous flora and fauna and other taonga, and also over Mātauranga Māori, or traditional knowledge. They went on to say that the Crown failed to protect the very taonga themselves, so not only the exercise of these relationships between Māori and taonga, but the actual taonga, that they weren't protected, and that the Crown even went to the next level and usurped the tino rangatiratanga and kaitiakitanga of Māori in respect of flora and fauna and other taonga through the development of policy and the enactment of legislation, and that the Crown breached the Treaty of Waitangi by agreeing to various international instruments that affect Indigenous flora and fauna and intellectual property rights and other rights to taonga. Further along the claim, the claimants became 7, and that Te Waka Kaiora, which is the Māori Organics team, they joined as claimants. So the claim tried to address some very important issues for the nation as a whole. Who owns and controls Māori culture? Should Māori have proprietary rights over Indigenous flora and fauna? And does the Crown have an obligation to actively protect taonga Māori from misappropriation? And do Māori have a right of veto over the use of taonga Māori? So these were some of the key underlying questions that the tribunal was being asked to consider. The claim is a very complex claim. So it includes, this is a description from Maui Solomon, who was one of the claimant counsel, because it was always very hard to describe it. It involves almost everything, all native species, all Māori arts and designs, traditional knowledge, plants, medicines, looks at DNA, genetic modification, and the understandings of science, the conduct of scientists and researchers, as well as policymakers and the Crown. So it looks at misappropriation of Māori culture, offensive use of Māori iconography, as well as inappropriate use where there's been no attribution or benefit sharing with Māori. And it looked also at trademark laws that prevent Māori from using Māori language terms. And one of the more bizarre examples of this is the case with the Māori singer Moana Maniapoto, who in going through a world tour was prevented in Germany of being able to promote herself using her name, which is Moana, because it had already been trademarked. So for the purposes of Germany, she had to change all of her advertising because she simply wasn't able to use her name. And this sort of resonated with people here at home. How can something as generic as your name, like mine, Aroha, how can I be prevented from ever using that name overseas purely because of these laws? So quite complex issues. The very nature of this claim was also reductionist. So it was looking at the big picture issues, but it was bringing it right down to the very level of DNA, genetic resources. So I'm saying not just about the relationship of Māori to their iwi, to their tribal territories, or even within those territories to landscapes and ecosystems, but we went below that into species and varieties and genetic resources. So not an easy claim for both the claimants or the tribunal. This gives you a timeline of how long it's taken to get to this point. So the claim was actually lodged in 1991. Took 7 years before hearings began, and that was for a range of reasons. One is that when the claim was lodged, I was working in government at that time, and it created an absolute shock and horror and paralysis, I might say. The Crown really did not know how to respond to this issue because the claim was challenging every aspect of what the Crown does. So it took 7 years to get to the point of hearings. And the hearings began in 1998. 2001, more evidence was required, and then it kind of went into a hiatus once more. During this time, the presiding officer of the tribunal, Judge Kearney, passed away, and they actually had to amend the legislation of the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal Act to enable a new presiding officer to come in. And that was Justice Joe Williams. So he fired up the claim again in 2006, issued what is called a statement of issues, which was the tribunal's attempt to try and group key issues within this very comprehensive claim and open it up for a second round of hearings. Those then finished in 2007, and we've waited 3.5 years for the report to be released. It was released in July of this year. So 20 years to complete the tribunal process. As I said, all of the original claimants have passed on. One claimant lived to hear the report, and she passed on soon after. That was Sana Murray. As well, claimant counsel passed on, the tribunal passed on. So it's been a very sad hearing. But here we are. These are just photos of the tribunal handing over the report to the claimant groups. And in the top right picture, those are all the photographs of those who've passed on. A lot of excitement in the air, and throughout all of this time, everyone has said, oh, you better wait for Y262, wait till Y262. It's become a catchphrase. So many meetings that I've attended, and everyone said, just wait for this report. So you can get a sense that it was going to be an impossible task for the tribunal to hand over a report that people would like, because everyone from every side and every spectrum thought that this report was going to answer all their questions. So the process was, it was handed over, and now we're in this next stage of reading it. No easy feat. The report is over 1,000 pages long. The executive summary is just over 300 pages long. And it's one of those reports, though, that you actually have to read all of it. Because if you only take one chapter, you will only get the analysis of key terms relevant to that chapter, and you won't see how those terms evolve through the remaining chapters. So it's very dangerous to only read part of it. So you either read the whole lot or don't read it, but read it, because it's quite an amazing piece of work. Divided into 8 chapters, and what I thought I'd do is look at 2 in particular, intellectual property and taonga works, and taonga and the conservation estate, just to give you a sense of some of the key findings. Look more specifically at when the Crown controls mātauranga Māori, and if there's time, I'll go through some of those other chapters. So what did this report say? Well, the context, I must say, is that no one was going to be completely happy. That was a done deal. And as one reads the report, it becomes very obvious that no one is completely happy with it. It's a challenge for both the Crown and for Māori. And there are no winners and there are no losers. Everyone has to kind of sort of zip it, bite the bullet, and kind of take on board what the tribunal has said. First of all, the report has come up with some new definitions. And I think the definitions are really quite helpful for those of us who are working in the area. So in Article 2 of the treaty, the term taonga is very important, because that's pretty much the thrust of Article 2, is that Māori interests in taonga are protected, that their rangatiratanga over taonga are protected. And there have been a number of tribunal claims and tribunal reports, rather, where they've elaborated and confirmed, for instance, that te reo Māori, the Māori language, is a taonga under Article 2. So the idea was, would the tribunal make Indigenous flora and fauna a taonga under Article 2? So the tribunal has come up with the term taonga species, which they define as being flora and fauna significant to the culture or identity of Māori iwi. They also make a distinction between taonga works and taonga-derived works. So taonga works are artistic and cultural works significant to the culture and identity of Māori iwi or hapu. And this is important because there is a body of inherited knowledge related to them. They invoke ancestors, and the iwi or hapu is obliged to act as their kaitiaki. So in other words, for something to be deemed a taonga work, there has to be an inherited body of knowledge, of culture associated with it, to such an extent that a hapu or an iwi will feel obliged to protect it, to act as their guardians. So a lot of new works don't come into this category at all. Then we have taonga-derived works, which is those that have, excuse me, that have a Māori element to them, but that element is generalised or adapted and is combined with other non-Māori influences. And I guess a good example of this would be the new art form that our tā moko specialists have come up with. This was a voluntary and very conscious decision of tā moko specialists who were getting increasing requests from non-Māori to get tā moko. So they didn't want to mix that up with using traditional Māori art forms or ancestral signs and symbols, so they developed this new art. And it's quite a generic art that's got nothing to do with a specific iwi history or a hapu history, but it's distinguishably Māori. So in that case, that is a taonga-derived work. Those marks that go back to a whānau or a hapu, those are taonga works. Now this is very helpful because we haven't had any definitive distinction of how you make, how you discuss the two areas. So I think their definitions are helpful. So my slide before, I talked about who owns and controls, and do Māori have proprietary interests over flora and fauna. So the big decision of the tribunal is that no, Māori do not have proprietary interests. I term it as nature before culture. So what the tribunal has said is that their first chapter goes right back to kupe. And I was just at a seminar at the University of Waikato with Justice Williams, and it was good to hear the rationale behind the tribunal's report. So the tribunal has taken this view that kupe is not a Māori. He was not a Māori, it was his descendants. And that the people who came here were not Māori. They became Māori as part of how they adapted to the natural environment. And that it was the relationship with the flora and fauna that created the language, that created the art, that created all other relationships that Māori have. And the tribunal decided that that was not a proprietary right. It did not give Māori a proprietary right. I disagree very strongly with this contention and indicated that to the tribunal, but they knew that many people would not be happy, and none of the claimants are either. The reason isn't about being greedy or thinking that Māori have supreme rights, but these rights are actually consistent with how, for instance, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was elaborated. And the definition has implications, not just for Māori, but for Indigenous peoples globally. The definition is about being the first peoples of the land. So this is taking us into a completely different discussion. However, that is the stance that the tribunal makes. And because of this, it impacts on how they have dealt with all the other issues in the chapters of the tribunal report. So the tribunal says that Māori have a Kaitiaki relationship, a guardianship relationship, and it entitles Māori to have a say and to participate in decision making, but it stops short of ownership. So then the tribunal went on to give some key statements to the Crown in particular, and the biggest statement is that Māori are not the other. It's a powerful statement, actually. The tribunal says in many parts of the report that the Crown has to stop seeing itself as Pākehā and English-speaking and Māori as the other. The Crown is both. The treaty partnership requires the Crown to think of both, not one and then think of the other as a side-on, the two of them together. This was the first whole of government inquiry in that every government department provided evidence towards the claim. The tribunal, in probably the strongest language that you'll find in the report, said that the Crown has often acted in a hostile way towards Mātauranga Māori issues. And one of the other comments they made, or observations, is that the Crown should not see the treaty principles as a menu where they pick and choose which ones they want to operationalise. This was particularly in response to DOC, Department of Conservation, who decided that of the menu of treaty principles, the one that they were committed to was the Crown's right to govern. And it didn't require them to think of any of the other treaty principles, like the duty to consult, to actively protect. So the tribunal has come down and said no more. All treaty principles must be read collectively. And while politicians might give you the idea that that the treaty principles are sort of out there in the air, they're not in any defined body, that's not true at all. The treaty principles are defined very clearly in tribunal reports and through treaty jurisprudence. So there are over 30 of them. There's a document that you can find on the Waitangi Tribunal website that actually outlines what each of the treaty principles are and gives examples of where those have been elaborated through court decisions. And the messages to Māori, is that the Crown does have a right to govern. So just as it would be difficult for the Crown to have heard that they can't think of themselves as English-speaking and English and Pākehā, but Māori, that would be a difficult message for this. This is a hard message for many of our hapu and iwi as well. But the tribunal has said, absolutely, the Crown has a right to govern and it has a right to represent New Zealand globally. So that conversation is off the table, it's a done. And then they talk about two types of interests. So given that Māori don't own flora and fauna, the tribunal says that Māori have two types of interests in things. One is a Kaitiaki interest, and then there's a whole body of work as to how you implement that. And the other is a rangatiratanga interest. So there is still a sovereignty aspect, but it's an interest as opposed to a right. And throughout the report, the tribunal uses what they call a sliding scale of how these Māori interests, be they Kaitiaki interests or rangatiratanga interests, are to be applied on a case-by-case basis. And the main message to both of the treaty partners is can't do business as usual, because business as usual has created a big mess and it's really not good practice and it needs a lot of work. It needs work at the Crown side and it needs work on the iwi side. And the other message is that it's overdue. Time is overdue for a more sophisticated treaty partnership. I guess my qualification to this finding, though, is that at the seminar in Waikato, I said it was almost like a marriage in dire need of counselling, because we have these two partners and one partner has got more out of the marriage than the other, and one partner thinks the other is just always complaining, never grateful, always whinging, and the other partner thinks the other one is like a taker, doesn't give back, really greedy, manipulative. One partner is a serial philanderer because he continues to enter into treaties, relationships with others without committing to honouring the primary relationship. Lots of bruises, lots of scars, lots of fights. But they stay together because when they think about the kids, they've got to consider the kids, and they just don't know what to do with chattels. Although one of the treaty partners is trying to sell off those chattels as quickly as they can. But this brings us to... So we have to position this tribunal report, at this stage of the marriage. Do these partners want to stay together? If they want to stay together, if they're prepared to recommit to the relationship, then the tribunal is a marriage counsellor indeed, and it provides a pathway as to how you would do that. Very constructive suggestions. But if the partner doesn't want to be there, then we have real problems. And, that's how we have to read this report. So let's hope that the marriage kind of sticks together, but fair to say both are still in it for the time being, albeit reluctantly. So let's look at the chapter on intellectual property in Taonga Works. I'm only going to skim these for you because obviously 1,000 pages is a lot to have to try and articulate to you. I guess the key works, the key recommendations here is that the tribunal says that we should be able to protect against derogatory or offensive use. We haven't had that protection in the past. That in certain circumstances, Kaitiaki, though we don't have a right, but Māori do have and should have the ability to object to commercial uses of Taonga works, not Taonga derived works, but Taonga works. And that we should develop a register of cultural works such as haka, ngā motetea, so that these can be easily identified. Well, for those of you who work with, who know about registers, they're very difficult things to organise, and not everyone is happy with such a process, but I think it offers a system anyway. And they also recommend a new commission, thank you, to hear objections to commercial uses. Best way of describing what the tribunal has done is tinkering of the existing system rather than a straight out call for a new system, or sui generis system, which is what claimants wanted, an indigenous specific IP system, which some other countries do have. Going to Māori and the environment. This is the chapter that really elaborates in great detail what it means to be Kaitiaki and that relationship with the environment. The tribunal suggests that there are 3 basic levels of protection that you can use, that might be applicable to Kaitiaki relationships. One is full decision making in the hands of Kaitiaki. The other is partnership with the Crown. Not merely Māori input, but genuinely shared decision-making. And the third is influence over decisions that affect the Kaitiaki relationship. What the tribunal is asking of the marriage partners is to actually move to one, acknowledging that we're not even there at 3. So it's a long road ahead to get to 1. But that is definitely a strong recommendation that they have. They've also looked at amending, they've asked for amendments to the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act to give greater weight to Kaitiaki interests in genetic modification decisions. And again, this is an important thing because if you look at some of our domestic legislation, issues around Māori are very waffly. Even though they are text in legislation that is meant to provide guidance, the actual words used to describe what a Māori interest might be are very generic. And it's things like give consideration to. But what does that mean? So the tribunal's trying to say we have to be a little bit more prescriptive, and we need to be